On a cold October morning in 1918, in a quiet clinic overlooking Lake Küsnacht in Switzerland, a frail man sat alone by a window. His eyes, once bright with ambition, now gazed emptily at the mist rolling across the water. His hands, which had once shaken those of emperors and kings, trembled slightly as they rested on the arms of his chair. For 16 years, this room had been his world, not the gilded ballrooms of Paris, not the marble corridors of London's finest hotels. Just this small, sterile space where the man who had redefined luxury itself waited for death in obscurity. His name was César Ritz, the king of hoteliers, the hotelier to kings, the man whose very surname had become synonymous with elegance, whose vision had transformed how the wealthy experienced the world. Yet here, in this forgotten corner of Switzerland, he barely recognized his own reflection. The nurses who cared for him had no idea that this confused, broken patient had once dined with the Prince of Wales, had been praised by emperors, had created palaces of pleasure that still bear his name more than a century later. When César Ritz died 3 days before the end of the First World War, the news barely registered in a world consumed by conflict. His wife Marie-Louise, desperate to reach him in his final hours, was delayed at the border. She arrived too late. The man who had made millions feel like royalty died utterly alone. But how did the most celebrated hotelier in history fall so far? How did a man who commanded the attention of every crowned head in Europe end up spending nearly 2 decades in the shadows of his own mind? To understand this tragedy, we must go back to the beginning, to a tiny village in the Swiss Alps where an impossible dream was born. In the village of Niederwald, tucked into a remote valley of Canton Valais, there stood a modest farmhouse where sheep outnumbered people, and the nearest city might as well have been on another planet. It was here, on February 23, 1850, that César Ritz entered the world as the 13th child of Johann Anton and Crescentia Ritz. 13 children in a peasant family meant hunger was a familiar companion. Young César spent his summers herding his father's sheep across mountain pastures, his winters huddled in the village schoolhouse learning basic letters and numbers. The great hotels of Europe, the glittering capitals of Paris and London, were as distant as the stars above the Alpine peaks. Yet something burned inside this youngest son that set him apart from his siblings. Even as a child, César noticed things. He noticed how light fell differently through windows at various times of day. He noticed which arrangements of wildflowers lasted longest in their simple vases. He noticed how certain gestures of hospitality, a warm greeting, an anticipated need, could transform a person's entire demeanor. These observations would one day revolutionize an industry. But first, they would nearly destroy him. At 15, his father made a decision that would alter history. César was sent to apprentice as a sommelier at a hotel in Brigue, a small town at the foot of the Simplon Pass. It was a modest establishment, nothing like the grand palaces César would later create. But for a shepherd boy from Niederwald, it was a glimpse into another universe entirely. The boy threw himself into his work with passionate intensity. He polished glasses until they sparkled like diamonds. He memorized wine regions, grape varieties, the preferences of every regular guest. He arrived early and stayed late, driven by an ambition that both impressed and unsettled those around him. Yet his intensity proved his undoing. In his eagerness to serve quickly, to anticipate every need, he became clumsy. Glasses slipped from his hands. Bottles crashed to the floor. The hotel's owner watched this nervous, over-eager boy with growing frustration until finally, he could take no more. The dismissal was brutal in its finality. The owner looked at this trembling teenager and delivered words that would echo through César's mind for the rest of his life. You will never make anything of yourself in the hotel business. You simply do not have the flair for it. Pack your things and go. Most young men would have accepted this verdict. Most would have returned to Niederwald, picked up a shepherd's crook, and resigned themselves to the life their birth had assigned them. But César Ritz was not most young men. Something in those cruel words ignited a fire that would never be extinguished. He would prove them wrong. He would prove them all wrong. At 17, with almost no money and barely any French, César Ritz arrived in Paris. The year was 1867, and the city was preparing for the Universal Exposition that would draw 7 million visitors from around the world. Emperor Napoleon III was determined to showcase French glory, and Paris pulsed with energy, ambition, and opportunity. The exposition was a marvel that defied imagination. The Champ de Mars had been transformed into a wonderland of pavilions representing every nation, every industry, every art form. Mechanical wonders demonstrated the power of the Industrial Revolution. Exotic goods from the farthest corners of empires dazzled visitors, and restaurants and hotels overflowed with guests from every country, all seeking accommodations in a city straining at its seams. For a peasant boy from the Alps, Paris was overwhelming. The grand boulevards, the elegant cafes, the sophistication of Parisian society. It was a world beyond anything he had imagined. The women wore gowns that cost more than his father earned in a year. The men spoke of politics and art and commerce with casual authority. Carriages rolled past bearing passengers who would not have acknowledged his existence had he stood directly in their path. Yet César did not shrink from it. He found work as a waiter in a workman's bistro, then moved to a small restaurant owned by a family named Chevalier. Here too his nervous energy betrayed him. He broke so many dishes in his haste that he was dismissed once again. 3 dismissals before the age of 20. Most young men would have given up. César only worked harder. But César learned from each failure. He learned to slow down, to breathe, to channel his intensity into observation rather than frantic action. He found a position at a restaurant on the corner of Rue Royale and Rue Saint-Honoré, and something remarkable happened. He stopped breaking things. He started excelling. His breakthrough came at Restaurant Voisin, the most fashionable dining establishment in all of Paris. The restaurant occupied a privileged position near the Madeleine, and its clientele included everyone who mattered in French society. The owner, a man named Bellinger, was a master of the hospitality arts, who recognized in this intense young Swiss something special. He took César under his wing, teaching him not just the mechanics of service but its philosophy. Service, Bellinger explained, was not about waiting on tables. It was about understanding human nature. Every guest who walked through the door brought invisible baggage, anxieties, and aspirations, fears and desires. The truly great server could read these unspoken needs and address them without ever acknowledging their existence. A nervous businessman needed reassurance. A woman dining alone needed protection from unwanted attention. A young couple needed privacy. An old aristocrat needed deference. The art was in providing each without drawing attention to the act. César absorbed these lessons like a sponge absorbs water. He began to study the guests at Voisin with almost scientific intensity. Sarah Bernhardt, the divine actress whose name alone could fill any theater. George Sand, the scandalous novelist who wore men's clothing and smoked cigars. Alexandre Dumas, whose tales of musketeers and counts had captured the imagination of the world. And countless aristocrats, politicians, and industrialists who shaped the destiny of nations. For young César, Voisin was a university of human nature. He learned that the wealthy were not fundamentally different from anyone else. They simply had more exacting standards and less patience for disappointment. He learned that true service was not about subservience, but about anticipation. The best waiter was invisible until needed, present without being noticed, attentive without being intrusive. But César's education was interrupted by catastrophe. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War erupted, and within months, Paris was under siege. The glittering world César had worked so hard to enter collapsed into chaos and starvation. The siege lasted from September 1870 until January 1871. Cut off from the outside world, Paris slowly starved. The elegant restaurants that had served the finest cuisine in Europe were reduced to serving whatever could be found. Horses were slaughtered for meat, then cats, then dogs, then rats. The wealthy, accustomed to luxury, found themselves standing in bread lines with their servants. At Voisin, the kitchen was reduced to desperate improvisation. On Christmas Day, 1870, the restaurant served the most infamous meal in French culinary history, a menu that included elephant trunk in chasseur sauce, prepared from animals butchered at the Paris Zoo when all other options had been exhausted. César served these desperate dishes to guests who paid fortunes for the privilege of eating zoo animals. He watched aristocrats weep over plates that would have been unthinkable months earlier. César survived the siege, but Paris would never be the same. Neither would he. The experience taught him something crucial about luxury. It was not merely pleasant. It was psychologically essential. After months of deprivation, people craved beauty with an almost physical hunger. They would pay almost anything to be surrounded by elegance, to be made to feel safe and pampered and special. This understanding would become the foundation of his empire. After the war, César began his ascent in earnest. He worked his way through the grand hotels of Europe, each position teaching him something new. In Vienna, he learned the importance of music and atmosphere. In Nice, he discovered how weather and location shaped the moods of guests. In Monte Carlo, he witnessed the intersection of wealth, gambling, and discretion that defined high society. It was in Lucerne, at the Grand Hotel National, that César truly came into his own. The hotel's owner, Max Pfeiffer, recognized in this intense young man something extraordinary. He gave César increasing responsibility, watching as the former shepherd boy transformed the hotel's restaurant into the finest in Switzerland. César's innovations were revolutionary. He insisted on fresh flowers on every table, changed daily. He demanded spotless linens, polished silver, and impeccably trained staff. He pioneered the concept of personal attention, keeping detailed notes on every regular guest's preferences, allergies, and eccentricities. When a guest returned, they found their favorite wine already chilled, their preferred table reserved, their dietary restrictions anticipated without any need to mention them. This was revolutionary. In most hotels of the era, guests were anonymous, interchangeable occupants of numbered rooms. César made them feel known, valued, important. A returning guest at the Grand Hotel National was greeted by name, shown to their favorite spot, served their preferred aperitif before they could order it. The effect was magical. Guests felt not like customers, but like treasured friends visiting a particularly gracious home. But it was in Monte Carlo that César encountered the man who would become his partner, his counterpart, and in many ways, his salvation. Auguste Escoffier was a small, quiet man with a meticulously trimmed mustache and an almost magical ability to transform ingredients into art. Where César was intense and excitable, Escoffier was calm and methodical. Where César managed the front of house with nervous energy, Escoffier commanded his kitchen with serene precision. They met when César was managing a hotel that belonged to his wife's aunt and uncle in Monte Carlo. César had lost his chef to a competitor and was desperate to find a replacement who could match his standards. Escoffier's reputation preceded him. When they finally met, the chemistry was immediate. Here were two men who shared an obsession with perfection, but expressed it in complementary ways. César understood atmosphere, service, the psychology of guests. Escoffier understood flavor, presentation, the architecture of a menu. Together, they were unstoppable. César understood what the wealthy wanted to feel. Escoffier understood what they wanted to taste. Their partnership would transform hospitality forever. In 1887, César Ritz took a step that surprised everyone who knew him. At 37 years old, the workaholic hotelier, who had never shown interest in anything but his profession, fell in love. Marie-Louise Beck was just 21, the daughter of hoteliers from Strasbourg. She was intelligent, multilingual, and possessed an impeccable eye for design and detail that would prove essential to César's success. Their courtship was brief, but passionate. César, who had spent 2 decades channeling every emotion into his work, discovered in Marie-Louise a partner who understood his obsession because she shared it. They married that same year, and from their wedding day forward, they were inseparable in both life and business. Marie-Louise's influence on César's work was immediate and profound. She had an instinct for color, fabric, and light that transformed his hotels from merely impressive to truly beautiful. It was Marie-Louise who chose the shade of peach that would become the signature color of Ritz towels, a hue she believed was the most flattering to a woman's complexion after bathing. It was Marie-Louise who insisted on wider staircases in their hotels, understanding that fashionable ladies in voluminous gowns needed room to descend elegantly. It was Marie-Louise who understood that luxury was not just about what guests saw, but about how they felt. They had 2 sons, Charles and René, but César was an absent father in the way of all obsessive men. His mind was always elsewhere, calculating, planning, worrying about details 1,000 miles away. Marie-Louise managed the household, raised the children, and served as César's constant advisor, all while watching the man she loved drive himself toward a precipice neither of them could see. In 1889, César Ritz received an offer that would change everything. Richard D'Oyly Carte, the theatrical impresario who had made a fortune producing Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, was opening a revolutionary new hotel in London. The Savoy would be the first truly modern luxury hotel in Britain, equipped with electric lights throughout, hydraulic lifts, and marble bathrooms with constant hot running water. D'Oyly Carte needed someone to run it who understood what luxury meant. He needed César Ritz. César brought Escoffier with him, and together they conquered London. The Savoy, under their management, became the most fashionable address in the British Empire. For the first time, aristocratic women could be seen dining in public without scandal. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, became a regular patron, declaring that where Ritz went, he would follow. César's innovations at the Savoy were revolutionary. He replaced the heavy German cuisine that had dominated English dining with Escoffier's lighter French preparations. He introduced electric lighting that flattered complexions. He fought to change licensing laws that forced restaurants to close at 11 o'clock. He created an atmosphere where business could be conducted, romances could flourish, and fortunes could be made or lost, all over Escoffier's exquisite food. The Savoy became more than a hotel. It became a stage where the drama of the late Victorian age played out. Oscar Wilde dined there with Lord Alfred Douglas, conducting the affair that would destroy him. Whistler and Monet painted the Thames from its windows. Sarah Bernhardt, Nellie Melba, and Lily Langtry graced its rooms. American millionaires like Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan came to César for guidance on how to navigate European society, and he taught them how to spend their fortunes with taste. But success at the Savoy came at a price that César did not fully understand until it was too late. He worked constantly, sleeping only a few hours each night, traveling between London and a dozen other properties across Europe. He was managing hotels in Nice, Monte Carlo, Rome, and Frankfurt simultaneously, his suitcases perpetually packed, his mind never at rest. The schedule would have destroyed most men. Consider a typical month in César's life during the Savoy years. He might begin in London, overseeing a state dinner for visiting dignitaries, personally inspecting every place setting, every flower arrangement, every detail that lesser managers would delegate. Then a telegram would summon him to Monte Carlo, where a crisis in the kitchen demanded his intervention. From there to Rome, where construction on his newest property required decisions only he could make. Then back to London, arriving exhausted, only to discover that standards had slipped in his absence. He could not rest. He could not trust. The perfectionism that had made him great now tormented him. Every imperfection was a personal failure. Every complaint from a guest struck him like a physical blow. He began to experience what he called dark periods, times when all his achievements seemed meaningless, when he questioned whether anything he had built would last. Marie-Louise watched these episodes with growing alarm, but César insisted they were nothing, merely fatigue that would pass with rest he never took. The Savoy's success spawned imitators and competitors. César responded by working even harder, by demanding even more from himself and his staff. He slept less. He worried more. He snapped at employees who had served him faithfully for years. The charming host who could make any guest feel like royalty was becoming, in private moments, a haunted man who could find no peace in his own achievements. And there was a darker current beneath the Savoy's glittering surface. César and Escoffier had developed a system that enriched them personally at the hotel's expense. They received kickbacks from suppliers. Wine and spirits disappeared from the cellars in quantities that could not be explained. The arrangement was not unusual for the time, but it was fraudulent, and it created a sword hanging over César's head that would eventually fall. The fall came in March of 1898. The Savoy's auditors discovered the extent of the irregularities. Over 3,400 pounds worth of wine and spirits had vanished. Suppliers had been paying commissions directly to Ritz and Escoffier. The legal advice was unambiguous. César Ritz, along with Escoffier and his deputy Louis Echenard, must be dismissed immediately. The sacking was kept quiet. César threatened to sue for wrongful dismissal, but was persuaded by Escoffier that a scandal would destroy them both. The official story became that César had resigned. His devoted friend Lady de Grey cancelled her party at the Savoy in protest, declaring that where Ritz went, she would follow. But the damage was done. César had lost the jewel in his crown, and the stress of the scandal would never fully leave him. Yet from this disaster came César's greatest triumph. He had long dreamed of a hotel that would be entirely his own, built according to his exact specifications, bearing his name. Now, with wealthy supporters who believed in his genius, he had the opportunity. In 1896, he formed the Ritz Hotel Syndicate with Alfred Beit, reputed to be the richest man in the world. Their target was the most prestigious address in Paris, the Place Vendôme. The building at number 15 Place Vendôme had a distinguished history. Originally constructed in 1705 as a private mansion for a duke, it had served various aristocratic families before falling into commercial use. Its facade, designed by the great Jules Hardouin-Mansart, was considered one of the finest examples of classical French architecture. For César, it was perfect, a shell of historical prestige into which he could pour his revolutionary vision. He hired architect Charles Meues to transform the interior. Together, they created something unprecedented. Every room would have its own bathroom, a luxury unheard of in European hotels. Every room would have electric lighting, a telephone, and central heating. The corridors would be wide enough for ladies in crinolines to walk two abreast. The lighting would be soft and indirect, flattering to complexions. The color scheme, chosen by Marie-Louise, would create an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy unknown in the cold grandeur of traditional palaces. But César's obsession with perfection drove him to the edge of sanity. He inspected every detail personally, from the angle of each light fixture to the thread count of each sheet. He fretted over the precise shade of the walls, the weight of the silverware, the crispness of the napkin folds. He could not delegate, could not trust anyone else to understand his vision. The hotel became his magnificent obsession, and it was destroying him from within. The Ritz Paris opened on June 1st, 1898, to a glittering reception that brought together the elite of European society. The Duke and Duchess de Rohan attended. Lady de Grey swept through the rooms, declaring them perfect. Cornelius Vanderbilt had traveled from New York just to witness the occasion. And Marcel Proust, the young novelist who would one day transform French literature, sat in a corner, quietly observing the pageant of vanity and ambition that would inspire his masterwork. On that opening night, the investors who had backed César's dream gathered to congratulate him. "Kings and princes will be envious of you, Ritz," they declared. "You are going to teach the world how one should live." And it was true. The Ritz was unlike anything that had come before. It combined modern technology with classical elegance, efficiency with warmth, innovation with tradition. It was, quite simply, the greatest hotel the world had ever seen. The guest list that summer read like a register of European power. Emperor Nicholas II of Russia reserved an entire floor. Sarah Bernhardt swept through the lobby trailing admirers. Cornelius Vanderbilt established a permanent suite, bringing American dollars and American energy to the Place Vendôme. And always, watching quietly from his favorite corner near the lobby, sat young Marcel Proust, gathering the details and observations that would fill his 7-volume masterpiece, In Search of Lost Time. Proust understood César in a way that perhaps no one else did. He saw how the hotelier moved through his creation, adjusting a flower arrangement here, murmuring instructions to a waiter there, always scanning for imperfections that only he could perceive. Proust recognized a kindred spirit, someone possessed by the need to capture and preserve fleeting moments of beauty. At the Ritz, "Nobody hurries you along," Proust would later write, describing the establishment as his second home, a place where time itself seemed suspended in amber. But what Proust also observed, and what he captured in his fiction, was the exhaustion beneath César's elegant exterior. The dark circles that makeup could not quite conceal, the hands that sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching, the sudden moments of absence, when César would seem to drift away from a conversation, his mind somewhere far distant and troubled. But something was wrong with César. Even as his dream was realized, he could not enjoy his triumph. He paced the corridors obsessively, finding flaws invisible to everyone else. He could not sleep, his mind racing with anxieties about every aspect of the operation. He snapped at staff who had served him loyally for years. Marie-Louise watched her husband with growing concern, recognizing the signs of a mind under unbearable strain. In the years following the Ritz Paris opening, César expanded his empire at a pace that should have been impossible. He opened hotels in Rome, Frankfurt, Madrid, and London. He consulted on properties from Cairo to Johannesburg. His suitcases, as Marie-Louise observed, were never fully unpacked. He was always arriving from or departing for some new destination, some new project, some new opportunity that demanded his personal attention. The Carlton Hotel in London, which opened in 1899, was nearly as ambitious as the Paris Ritz. César worked obsessively on every detail, driving himself and his staff to exhaustion. The future King Edward VII became a regular patron, as did the international aristocracy who followed royal fashion. But César could not savor his success. Each triumph only created new anxieties, new standards to maintain, new competitors to fear. And then came 1902, the year that would end César Ritz's career forever. The coronation of King Edward VII was scheduled for June 26th. It was to be the greatest celebration Britain had seen in a generation. The new king, who had waited so long in his mother Victoria's shadow, would finally claim his throne, and César Ritz, the man Edward had called the hotelier to kings, was determined to make the Carlton's coronation celebration the most magnificent event in London's history. For months, César worked on every detail. The menus were designed by Escoffier himself, featuring dishes created specifically for the occasion. The decorations transformed the Carlton into a palace worthy of royalty. The guest list read like a directory of European aristocracy. Invitations were coveted like precious gems. Fortunes were spent on gowns and jewelry for the occasion. César supervised it all, sleeping barely 2 hours a night, his mind racing with possibilities and anxieties. The flowers alone took weeks to arrange. César insisted on blooms from specific suppliers in precise colors that would complement the decorations. The linens were inspected and re-inspected. The silver was polished until it shone like mirrors. The wine cellar was stocked with vintages worthy of kings. Every candle was measured to ensure they would burn for exactly the right duration. Nothing was left to chance. 2 days before the coronation, news arrived that shattered everything. The king was gravely ill. An emergency appendectomy was required. The coronation was postponed indefinitely. César received the news calmly, too calmly. He canceled the orchestra. He instructed the kitchens to halt preparations. He sent messages to the suppliers. He moved through the hotel mechanically, efficiently, doing everything that needed to be done. And then, in the middle of a conversation with a staff member, he collapsed. The diagnosis was what they called in those days a nervous breakdown. Today, we might recognize it as a complete psychological collapse, possibly triggered by what we now understand as bipolar disorder. For years, César had lived at an unsustainable pitch of intensity. His highs had been manic, productive, brilliant. His lows had been hidden from everyone, even Marie-Louise. Dark periods when he doubted everything he had achieved. Now the fragile structure of his mind simply gave way. The doctors prescribed rest, but rest was impossible for a man whose entire identity was bound up in work. They suggested travel, but every destination reminded him of hotels he had built, standards he must maintain, details that required his attention. They recommended time with family, but his sons barely knew him, and Marie-Louise, though devoted, could not reach him in the depths to which he had sunk. In the months following his collapse, César would sometimes seem to recover. He would take an interest in the hotels again, would dictate letters to his managers, would even travel to inspect properties. These periods gave Marie-Louise hope. Perhaps this was merely exhaustion. Perhaps with time he would return to himself. But each recovery was followed by a deeper descent, a longer period of darkness, a more complete withdrawal from the world he had created. Marie-Louise's account of what followed is heartbreaking. "He gradually sank out of life," she wrote. "A dark cloud seemed to envelop his mind. It lifted only at brief intervals during the 15 years that elapsed before death released him." The man who had built an empire of light and beauty was now trapped in endless darkness. César recovered enough to take some part in planning the London Ritz, which opened in 1906. But he was never the same. The fire that had driven him, the attention to detail that had made him legendary, the ability to see what others could not, all of it was gone. What remained was a hollow man, moving through the motions of life without truly living. He sold his interests in hotel after hotel. Frankfurt went in 1905. The Ritz Hotel Development Company followed in 1907. The Carlton in 1908. Finally, in 1911, even the Paris Ritz slipped from his grasp. By 1912, according to Marie-Louise, to all intents and purposes, his life had finished. In 1913, César was placed in a private hospital in Lausanne. The following year, he was moved to a clinic on Lake Küsnacht in Canton Schwyz. There, in a small room overlooking the water, the king of hoteliers spent his final years. The clinic was comfortable but not luxurious. César, who had spent his life creating spaces of unprecedented beauty, now lived in a simple room with institutional furniture and bare walls. The irony was lost on him. By this point, he barely recognized his surroundings. He did not know that his name adorned the most famous hotels in the world. He did not remember the kings and queens who had dined at his tables. He did not understand why this woman, Marie-Louise, visited him with such devotion, sitting by his bedside for hours, talking about a life he could no longer recall. There were moments of clarity, brief windows when the fog would lift and César would recognize where he was, would ask about the hotels, would want to know if standards were being maintained. These moments were perhaps more painful than the confusion. To remember what he had been, to understand what he had become, only to sink back into darkness, this was a cruelty beyond measure. Marie-Louise bore it all. She ran the Paris Ritz in his absence, maintaining the standards he had established, protecting the legacy he could no longer defend. She raised their sons to understand who their father had been, even as that father became a stranger. She visited the clinic whenever travel permitted, sitting with a husband who sometimes did not know her name, and she kept faith that somehow, somewhere, the man she had married still existed within the shell that remained. What went through César's mind during those long years of twilight? Did he remember the alpine pastures of his childhood, the sheep he had herded across mountain meadows? Did he recall the first time he walked into Restaurant Voisin and glimpsed the world he would one day command? Did he think of Marie-Louise, who visited when she could, but who had her own burdens, running the Paris Ritz in his absence, raising their sons, maintaining the empire he could no longer manage? We cannot know. The records from those years are sparse. The war that consumed Europe from 1914 onward made travel difficult, communication unreliable. César existed in a kind of limbo, suspended between life and death, between the world he had created and the darkness that had claimed him. Outside the clinic walls, the world César had known was dying. The First World War shattered the aristocratic order that had been his clientele. The crowned heads who had dined at his tables were overthrown, exiled, or executed. The Belle Époque, that golden age of elegance he had helped define, ended in mud and blood and poison gas. By the time the guns finally fell silent, nothing would ever be the same. César Ritz died on October 26, 1918, just days before the armistice that ended the war. Marie-Louise had attempted to reach him, but border restrictions delayed her. She arrived too late. The man who had spent his life anticipating every need, who had made millions feel welcomed and cherished, died without a single familiar face to comfort him. He was buried in Paris, though his remains were later returned to Nederwald, the village of his birth. Today, visitors to that remote Swiss valley can follow a path dedicated to its most famous son. The farmhouse where he was born still stands. The mountains he once traversed with his father's sheep still rise against the sky. And in cemeteries, his grave reminds us that even the greatest dreams have endings. But César Ritz's true legacy cannot be found in Nederwald. It lives in the Place Vendôme, where the Ritz Paris still welcomes guests seeking perfection. It lives in Piccadilly, where the London Ritz continues to set the standard for elegance. It lives in every hotel that strives to anticipate a guest's needs, to create an atmosphere of warmth and beauty, to transform a mere stay into an experience. The word Ritzy entered the English language because of what César created. It means expensive, elegant, luxurious, but it means more than that. It implies a certain effortless grace, a seamless attention to detail, a commitment to beauty that transcends mere wealth. These were the qualities César Ritz brought to everything he touched. What caused his breakdown? The question haunts anyone who studies his life. Was it simply overwork, the inevitable result of decades of impossible intensity? Was it an underlying condition, perhaps bipolar disorder, that had driven both his manic creativity and his ultimate collapse? Was it the stress of the Savoy scandal, the knowledge that his empire was built partly on fraud? Or was it something deeper, some flaw in the very ambition that had lifted a shepherd boy to the heights of international society? Perhaps it was all of these things, combined with the peculiar vulnerability of perfectionism. César Ritz could never be satisfied, never be. Every success only revealed new imperfections. Every achievement only raised the standards he had to meet. He created a vision of luxury so complete, so demanding, that not even he could live up to it. In the end, the dream consumed the dreamer. Marie-Louise Ritz lived until 1961, reaching the remarkable age of 93. She spent the years after César's death preserving his legacy, running the Paris Ritz with the same attention to detail he had demanded. She wrote a biography of her husband that shaped how the world remembered him, carefully omitting the Savoy scandal and emphasizing his genius rather than his fragility. In her memoir, she painted a portrait of a visionary consumed by his own vision. She described his relentless pursuit of perfection, his inability to accept anything less than the best, his conviction that every detail mattered because guests, even unconsciously, perceived everything. She explained his philosophy that a hotel should feel like a great private home, not an institution, that service should be invisible until needed, that luxury was not about ostentation but about anticipation. But Marie-Louise also hinted at darker truths. She wrote of César asking her, in his moments of doubt, "What have I achieved?" Nothing. She described how he could never enjoy his successes, how each triumph only revealed new challenges, new standards to meet, new competitors to fear. She captured the paradox of a man who created joy for others while finding so little for himself. Their sons continued the family tradition in their own ways. Charles became involved in hotel management. Renee pursued other interests, but neither achieved the heights their father had reached, nor suffered the depths of his fall. Perhaps they understood better than anyone the price of such ambition. Today, the Ritz Paris stands as a monument to César's vision. In 2012, it closed for a massive renovation, the first comprehensive restoration in its history. When it reopened in 2016, after 4 years of painstaking work, 95% of the original light fixtures had been preserved. The famous peach towels still graced the bathrooms. The Salon Proust still honored the novelist, who had found inspiration within its walls. The bar Hemingway still served cocktails to guests seeking a taste of legend. Walking through the Ritz today, one can still sense César's presence. The soft lighting, the attention to proportion, the invisible service that anticipates every need, these are his fingerprints, preserved across more than a century. The guest rooms are named for the famous visitors who once stayed there: Coco Chanel, who lived in a suite for over 2 decades, Marcel Proust, Ernest Hemingway, Charlie Chaplin. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is the suite named for César himself, where guests can sleep surrounded by the vision of a man who dreamed of perfection and nearly achieved it. The London Ritz, too, continues to honor its founder's legacy. The Palm Court, with its soft apricot tones, still hosts the most famous afternoon tea in Britain. The dining room, often called the most beautiful in Europe, still glitters with chandeliers and gilded bronze. The corridors remain wide enough for 2 ladies in crinolines, even though such fashions have long since passed. And the distinctive bell that once alerted staff to the arrival of royalty still hangs by the door, though now it rings for different kinds of kings. But perhaps the truest measure of César Ritz's achievement is not the hotels that bear his name. It is the transformation he wrought in human expectations. Before Ritz, hotels were places to sleep. After Ritz, they were experiences to be savored. Before Ritz, service was about providing what guests requested. After Ritz, it was about anticipating what they desired before they knew it themselves. Before Ritz, luxury was about ostentation. After Ritz, it was about effortless elegance. Every hotel that greets returning guests by name is following César's example. Every restaurant that keeps notes on customer preferences is practicing his philosophy. Every establishment that invests in training staff to anticipate needs is building on his foundation. In this sense, César Ritz did not merely create hotels, he created a new standard for how human beings could treat one another. Yet we cannot tell César's story without acknowledging its shadows. He was a perfectionist who drove himself and others to exhaustion. He was a businessman who enriched himself through questionable means. He was a husband and father who prioritized his work over his family. He was a man who achieved extraordinary things and paid an extraordinary price. His 16 years in that Swiss clinic are as much a part of his legacy as his glittering hotels. Perhaps that is the final lesson of César Ritz's life. Excellence has a cost. The same intensity that enables greatness can also destroy the person who possesses it. The same perfectionism that creates beauty can become a prison from which there is no escape. César Ritz gave the world a new vision of what hospitality could be. In return, the world took everything he had. As the sun sets over Lake Kusnacht, where César spent his final years, The light plays across the water in patterns he would have appreciated. He had an eye for such things, for the way illumination creates mood, for the subtle gradations of color that most people never notice. In his prime, he would have calculated how to capture that light, how to frame that view, how to make guests feel they were experiencing something precious and irreplaceable. Now the clinic where he lived is long gone, replaced by other buildings, other purposes. The waters of the lake are the same waters he gazed upon, but they reflect a different world. The crowned heads who were his clientele have largely disappeared. The social order they represented has crumbled. The certainties of the Belle Époque have given way to a century of upheaval and change. And yet, walk into the Ritz Paris on a spring evening. Watch the light filter through the tall windows onto the Place Vendôme. See the immaculate staff glide between tables, anticipating needs before they are expressed. Taste Escoffier's legacy in the cuisine that still bears his influence, and you will understand that some things do endure. César Ritz spent 16 years in darkness, but his light never entirely went out. It burns still in every perfectly turned down bed, every precisely mixed cocktail, every moment when a guest feels not merely served, but truly cared for. The shepherd boy from Niederwald, who was told he would never succeed in the hotel business, created something that outlived empires, survived world wars, and continues to define excellence more than a century after his death. That is his monument. Not the clinic where he suffered, not even the grave where he rests, but the experience of walking into a place that bears his name and feeling, for a moment, like royalty. César Ritz understood that feeling better than anyone before or since. And though the price he paid was terrible, the gift he gave the world endures. The mist still rolls across Lake Küsnacht as it did on that October morning in 1918. The mountains of Switzerland still rise toward heaven. And somewhere, in a grand hotel in Paris or London, a guest is being treated with the kind of care that César Ritz first imagined, in another era, in another world, before the darkness came. He never made anything of himself in the hotel business, they said. The man they dismissed created an empire. The man they underestimated changed the world. The man they pitied at the end left behind a legacy that will never fade. His name was César Ritz, the king of hoteliers, the hotelier to kings, and this has been his story. But stories do not truly end. They echo through time, changing shape, gaining meaning, inspiring those who come after. César Ritz's story echoes still in every hotel that strives for excellence, in every service professional who understands that their work is not merely functional but sacred, in every moment when someone far from home feels, suddenly, welcomed and valued and cared for. The shepherd boy, who was told he would never succeed, created an empire. The perfectionist who could never be satisfied set standards that endure a century later. The man who gave joy to millions found none for himself. The dreamer who built palaces of pleasure ended his days in a clinic overlooking a Swiss lake, waiting for a death that came too slowly and too alone. This is the tragedy of César Ritz, but it is also his triumph, for the light he created, the beauty he imagined, the standards he established. These things outlived his suffering. They outlived the world he knew. They will outlive us all. Somewhere tonight, in a grand hotel in Paris or London, or a dozen cities that César never saw, someone is being treated with the kind of care he first imagined. Somewhere, a returning guest is being greeted by name. Somewhere, a small kindness is being extended, a need anticipated, a moment made beautiful, and though that guest will never know it, Though the server may never have heard the name, they are all, in their way, honoring the memory of a man who believed that luxury was not about wealth, but about care, not about ostentation, but about attention, not about what you had, but about how you made others feel. That is his monument. That is his story. That is the secret life and tragic end of César Ritz.